Hi, and thank you so much for popping by. My name is Dr. Bita Pobaluzui, and you are most welcome to this conversation today. Recently ended UN General Assembly had me really thinking about some of the aspects that some African leaders were really advocating for or raising awareness about. And one of those key aspects was this idea that for the past 80 years, Africa has not had a seat or a permanent seat in the UN Security Council. The emphasis is on the permanent seat, right? At the moment, Africa is on a rotational basis together with other countries to serve on 2-year terms as some of the non-permanent seat holders in the council. So the members that are holding permanent seat are the countries that specifically came out victorious after World War II, right? And these countries in particular are, of course, China, France, Russia, the United Kingdom, and the United States. Our current members who hold permanent seats are bestowed with the ability to effectively manage this idea of international peace and security. Other countries in the world that are not holding permanent seats are all kind of calling for the UN General Security Council to come up with reforms that will actually acknowledge that there are new and emerging global superpowers, right? And as I say that, I found research that is showing that nations such as Japan, nations such as India, nations such as Brazil, for example, are all part of this G4 nations. And the G4 nations are these nations that are literally saying, we are ready to serve on the UN Security Council, specifically because we are new and emerging global superpowers. And of course, the more you read this conversation about why some countries are underrepresented or not included in the permanent seats of the UN Security Council, you start to see this issue of a lack of internal consensus within specific regions in terms of who they are going to designate or who they are going to identify as the country or the nation that will hold the position on that council and that will represent the rights or represent the interests, sorry, not the rights, but that will represent the interests of the other member countries, right? And at some point, they also state that South Africa was suggested as the preferred choice to be the member state that would hold the position of Africa on the UN Security Council. Why? Why South Africa? Well, it was being considered, some of the factors that were being considered is that South Africa holds a sense of diplomatic weight, right? That South Africa holds diplomatic weight not only within the African region, but outside of the African region. And they gave the example of the fact that South Africa has been sitting on the BRICS fora, which is all about leading and emerging economies. South Africa has been sitting on BRICS since 2010. So they have that experience already, and therefore they can leverage on that, right? But of course, like I'm saying, there was resistance. At some point, I believe it was in 2004, countries Egypt and Nigeria had volunteered to serve as permanent members on the UN Security Council. The key word here is they had volunteered. On the contrary side, issues of poverty, issues of terrorism, issues of internal socioeconomic challenges are one of the reasons why Nigeria in particular had some kind of pushback when they were volunteering to serve on the UN Security Council. And countries were saying, Nigeria lacks credibility because of its poor human rights situation in the country. And of course, Nigeria was saying, but we, on the other hand, are the largest population in Africa, and we hold a strong presence within the West African region through this organization of ECOWAS, right? The Economic Community of West African States. Senegal was instead proposing that they look at this idea of picking one country from Francophone Africa and one country from Anglophone countries, right? And this is where colonization comes into play, right? But one of the issues that is really coming up for me as I'm reading the story of why Africa is not serving on the UN Security Council as a permanent member is that, I feel like Africa needs to start showing its maturity. Do you know what I mean? Like, I feel like it's time for Africa to show its maturity to the world. And if they can do that, then I believe that the world can start taking Africa even more seriously. Specifically, when we're talking about these issues of global arenas and global forums, right? So there's a lack of trust. That's one key thing. There's a lack of consensus. That's another key thing. And this is why, as I was reading the story, I was starting to think about the clip that I made about intra-African diplomacy and Pan-Africanism. That if those two concepts were to work, they would put Africa in a more solid position, in a more advantageous position in the global arena, specifically on issues of consensus, right? It would be more seamless. It would be more easier for the African region to make decisions on the global stage if the concepts of Pan-African diplomacy and Pan-Africanism were to work, this idea of solidarity and togetherness, right? And researchers or advocates are really saying that this is a form of institutional discrimination when regions such as Africa or regions such as Latin America are not in a position to hold these permanent seats on the UN Security Council. And their arguments are varied and they are diverse. But if you look more into this story, there's also another layer which is coming up. And this layer is in context to where Africa is going strategically in terms of its partnership and its ties. So, for example, if you look at Nigeria, it's reported to be gaining strong ties with China. And if you ask me, I think China is gaining strong ties with a lot of African countries. I often say that China is not as loud with its diplomacy, right? China is very subtle and strategic with diplomacy, right? Alrighty, my friend. That's literally what I was thinking about as I was wondering why Africa is not sitting on the UN Security Council as a permanent member. And of course, the more you read the story, the more complexities that come up, and essentially just a lack of trust and consensus within the African region internally. Alrighty, my friend, I thank you so much for popping by. I hope you are having a lovely day where you are, but most importantly, I hope you're having a healthy day wherever you're watching me from. Bye.